Thank you very much, Mr. Toastmaster. Sometimes, when we are young, we grow up suddenly and unexpectedly without really knowing that's happening at the moment. That's exactly what happened to me when I was in 6th grade. I signed up to be a future paper boy with the Pittsburgh Press. Future because you're really not supposed to be a paper boy until you're in 8th grade. So I was on the waiting list, and I was first in line. The current paper boy was a gentleman named David Sales. He was a freshman in high school. He was a neighbor. His family and our family were friends. We lived about a block apart. This is September of 1962. In October of 1962, David had an epileptic attack in the high school swimming pool. And before he could be rescued, he drowned. A pall cast over the neighborhood. I remember this day as vividly as if it were yesterday. The last thing anybody was thinking about was delivering newspapers. But right on time, the Pittsburgh Press paper truck came to David's house, unloaded 3 big bales of papers. And before he could get that last bale out, people were rushing up to him and telling him what happened. And now there was another problem. There was nobody to deliver the paper. So the route manager who drove the truck put the bales of paper back in the truck and drove to our house. But I wasn't old enough. I was only in 6th grade. And suddenly I had to deliver these papers. I had no training. Wasn't even quite sure where the route was. But he gave me the papers. He gave me this book of receipts. It's like stubs. And on each sheet were the addresses of the places I had to go. Well, by the time all of this happened, I was an hour late, getting normally started. And I didn't know where I was going and how I was doing it, and it took me 2.5 hours to do something that normally would take about 45 minutes to an hour. And by the time I figured things out and got to the end of the route, I had customers that were very angry. Where have you been? Where's my paper? Why is it taking so long? Do you know what time it is? All of these questions. And of course, every time I had to explain, they were sympathetic. But guess what? It made me that much later to the next customer. That was my first lesson in customer care. Tragic circumstances, but now I was a paper boy. Well, this was an especially rainy and windy October in Pittsburgh. And if you know anything about Pittsburgh, it's a very hilly city. There's no such thing as a flat street or a level street. The houses are up on top of terraces, lots of steps to get to them. And so every Thursday, I would have to go and do what they call collections. Go around to each house and collect the money for the prior week's paper. Well, the paper cost 7 cents. The Sunday paper was 25 cents. So it wasn't a lot of money by our standards today, but that's what it cost in those days. Well, what I didn't realize was that collection time, from the customer's point of view, was also complaint time. It was when they saw me face to face. It was also special request time. So I go up to Mrs. Harris's house, who lives way up on a hill, and she says to me, "Yesterday my paper was wet. It was soaked. I want you from now on to make sure that when you throw that paper up, that it lands at least 3 feet inside my porch. Because when it rains or it snows, that's where it gets wet. Request number 1. Then I went to some more houses, and suddenly I had another request. Yesterday, my paper blew away. I know you folded it like this, but it came open and it blew away. From now on, you have to put my paper under the doormat. And so once again, climb up the steps, put it under the mat, go on to the next house. Another lady wanted her paper inside the milk box. Remember milk boxes? And then there was Mr. Anderson. He wanted his paper never folded, but always put inside the storm door. But then he said, if you do that for me every day, I will give you a 25-cent tip. Well, 25 cents, 1962, 6th grader. That was an incentive. And you can believe Mr. Anderson was taken care of. Well, I learned about tips. I learned about the connection between tips and customer care. Most people gave me a dime. That was my weekly tip. Some people gave me a nickel. Some people thought they were being generous by giving me a couple pennies. They would dig into this little bowl that they had by their front door where they kept the stubs from all the papers, and they would come out and give me a penny or two. And that was fine. It was a way of recognizing. But I also learned some things that were much more important than earning money. When I figured it all out, I earned about $1.65 an hour. I collected about $50 or so from all the papers, had to pay the newspaper about $35 or $36. So I had about $14 or $15 left over from all of that, plus I had about $7 or $8 in tips, and that's how I made my money. Well, more important than the money is I learned some important life lessons. And that's the value of being on a paper route, or having a first job in general. I learned about priorities. I would come home from school, I'd play with my friends. 4:30 the paper truck would come. I had to stop playing. I had a job to do. I also learned about Get Up and Go. It was the afternoon paper, but it was also the Sunday morning paper. So Sunday morning, very early, there was the truck. I had to get up, and Sundays were always a problem because you had to take the different sections and put them together. The comics inside and so forth and so on, all the supplements. So there I was putting it together, and I had to have that Get Up and Go. And you know, Get Up and Go is really tough. When it's 2 degrees outside and the wind is howling and there's snow on the ground and you are freezing. I also learned about customer care and the importance of those relationships. Because when you took care of your customers, they took care of you. But most important of all, I learned about responsibility. When you give somebody responsibility, they in fact become more responsible. And I think that is truly the biggest lesson of a first job, is getting that responsibility not from your parents, not from the school, but from an employer, and learning how to accept it and to carry it with you into the future.